How does a 19-year-old woman, purchased for the price of a mansion and locked in a room for 40 nights with a man ordered to claim her, emerge not only unharmed, but scientifically untouched? On November 24, 1845, police broke down an attic door on Rue Royale to find a scene that defied logic. The woman, known only as Lot 47, stood in a pristine white silk gown. Beside her, the city's wealthiest heir lay dead in a pool of his own blood. He had chosen to end his own lineage rather than touch her. Why? This wasn't a crime of passion. It was a biological paradox. The man was young, healthy, and under strict orders to produce an heir. The woman was the most expensive human asset ever sold in New Orleans, valued at $8,400, specifically for her beauty. Yet, forensic reports confirmed that every time he approached her, his body physically violently rejected the union. For 60 years, the police report was sealed. Witnesses claimed the room was cursed. Doctors called it moral insanity, but they were all wrong. The force that kept them apart wasn't magic, and it wasn't hatred. The answer lay hidden inside a small velvet locket, tucked inside a prayer book, a single piece of paper that proved this transaction was not just a sale, but a massacre of the natural order. What you are about to hear is the true story of the purchase that destroyed a dynasty. A mystery where the blood itself refused to be bought. Subscribe today before the story, because the most terrifying things in history aren't the ghosts. They are the documents left behind. The archive of the St. Louis Hotel, once the epicenter of the French Quarter's social and commercial life, preserves a single auction catalogue from October 14, 1845, which lists the human inventory to be liquidated that afternoon. Among the standard entries for field hands, skilled carpenters, and domestic servants, one listing stands out for its breathless description, penned in the flowery script of the era. Lot 47 is described not merely as a domestic worker, but as Celeste, a 19-year-old fancy maid, guaranteed untouched, raised in absolute seclusion on a small Acadiana convent plantation. The entry notes that she possesses the demeanor of a saint, a marketing flourish designed to appeal to the peculiar vanity of New Orleans' wealthy elite, who often sought beauty that mirrored the sacred icons they worshipped on Sundays. The rotunda of the St. Louis Hotel was a masterpiece of architectural imposingness, a soaring dome of glass and cypress that trapped the humid Louisiana heat and the heavy atmosphere of commerce. On that particular Tuesday, the space was packed shoulder to shoulder with the apex predators of the antebellum South: sugar barons from Cuba, cotton kings from Natchez, and banking magnates from New York. They had gathered not for the agricultural labor, but for the spectacle of Lot 47, whose reputation had been carefully cultivated through whispered rumors in the coffee houses along Chartres Street. It was said she'd been educated by Ursuline nuns, that she spoke flawless French, and that she carried herself with an elegance that defied her legal status as property. Victor Laurent stood at the front of this assembly, a man whose influence stretched from the wharves of the Mississippi to the Supreme Court of Louisiana. As the city's wealthiest cotton broker, Laurent was a figure of terrifying authority, a widower who had built a dynasty on ruthlessness and an obsession with European heritage. He was seeking a wedding gift for his only son, Philippe, a young man of 22 who was scheduled to marry into the powerful Duchamp family in 6 weeks. The gift had to be unique, a symbol of the Laurent power to possess the unreachable, and Victor had fixed his gaze on Celeste with a singular, possessive intensity. He did not look at her as a man looks at a woman, but as a collector looks at a rare artifact that must be secured to complete a set. When Celeste was led onto the auction block, the gathered crowd fell into a hush that witnesses described as church-like, a silence born of awe and discomfort at the girl's composure. She did not weep, nor did she tremble or cast her eyes downward in the performative shame expected of such moments. Instead, she stood with a stillness that seemed to lower the temperature in the sweltering room, her hands clasped before her in a posture of prayer, her eyes fixed on a point in the middle distance that no one else could see. She wore a simple dress of grey wool, yet the auctioneer introduced her as a queen in waiting, a phrase that would later appear in the transcripts of the legal proceedings that dismantled the Laurent fortune. The auctioneer began the bidding at $2,500, a price already exceeding the value of a skilled blacksmith, but the numbers escalated with a speed that defied economic logic. Within minutes, the price had soared past $4,000, driven by a rivalry between a visiting Cuban aristocrat and Victor Laurent. The crowd watched in stunned fascination as the two men traded bids like blows in a duel, pushing the value of a single human life beyond the cost of a fully furnished mansion in the Garden District. The air grew heavy with the realization that this was no longer a commercial transaction, but a display of dominance, a public measuring of souls weighed in gold and silver. At $7,000, the Cuban baron bowed out, shaking his head and muttering that no flesh was worth such a sum, leaving Victor Laurent as the undisputed victor of the day. But Laurent was not satisfied with merely winning. He raised his own bid one final time, driving the price to an unheard-of $8,400, a gesture of absolute power intended to silence any whispers about his financial liquidity. The hammer fell with a crack that echoed like a gunshot through the rotunda, sealing a contract that would cost him far more than the bank draft he signed with a flourish. The applause that erupted was polite but hesitant, as if the onlookers sensed they had witnessed a transgression against the natural order of commerce. Before Celeste was led away, the auctioneer performed the final ritual of the sale, reading aloud a certificate of virtue signed by two prominent physicians and a Jesuit priest. The document attested, under penalty of perjury, that Lot 47 was physically intact, a virgin vessel worthy of the highest household. This detail was crucial, for Victor Laurent did not intend Celeste to be a laborer. She was to be a corrective instrument for his son, a test of adulthood and a lesson in domination for a boy he considered too soft for the harsh realities of their world. As the guards moved to escort her to Laurent's waiting carriage, Celeste finally broke her statue-like pose, turning her head slowly to look directly at Victor Laurent. A journalist for the New Orleans Bee, who was present to document the record-breaking sale, noted in his diary that her expression contained no fear, no hatred, but a terrifying recognition, as if she were a judge looking down from a high bench upon the accused. She did not speak, but her gaze lingered on Laurent's face for a long, uncomfortable moment, a silent communication that caused the great cotton broker to flinch visibly before he turned his back and ordered the carriage to depart. The carriage rolled away down the cobblestones of Rue Royale, disappearing into the humid twilight of the French Quarter, carrying with it a secret that had been buried for 19 years. The crowd dispersed to the bars and gambling halls, eager to discuss the extravagance of the sale, unaware that the transaction they had just witnessed was the opening move in a tragedy. The perfect ornament for the Laurent prestige had entered the house, not as a prize, but as a silent force carrying the destruction of the very lineage she had been brought to serve. The first indication that the purchase of Lot 47 was not a standard acquisition appears in the household ledgers of the Laurent estate, kept by the meticulous mute servant known as Old Thomas. In the week following the auction, the ledger records the purchase of exorbitant quantities of white silk, French lace, and beeswax candles, items typically associated with a wedding trousseau rather than the provisioning of an enslaved person. The entries are penned in a shaky hand, contrasting with Thomas's usual precise script, suggesting a state of agitation or fear. Most disturbing is a note in the margins next to the order for a heavy iron lock, installed on the attic door. Key held by Monsieur Victor. The air upstairs is cold. Victor Laurent had prepared the attic suite of his townhouse with the lavishness of a honeymoon chamber, draping the walls in damask and furnishing the room with a massive four-poster bed imported from Paris. It was here that he installed Celeste, locking her away from the rest of the household like a princess in a tower, accessible only to himself and his son. The anomaly lay in the strict instructions given to the staff. No one was to speak to her, no one was to touch her, and under no circumstances was she to be given work of any kind. She was to exist in suspended animation, a living doll waiting to be utilized, preserving the expensive purity that had cost 8,400 lots. The plan, as reconstructed from Victor's correspondence with his lawyer, was for Philippe to visit the attic nightly in the weeks leading up to his marriage. Victor believed that his son's reputed weakness, a preference for poetry over business, and a reluctance to engage in the cruelties of estate management, could be cured by the possession of such a pristine creature. It was to be a rite of passage, a private conquering that would harden the boy before he took his place as the head of a new household. However, the first anomaly recorded in the servant's observations was Philippe's reaction to the gift. When presented with the key to the attic, the young man did not show excitement, but a profound instinctive dread, dropping the heavy iron object as if it were burning hot. On the first night of the arrangement, the household staff reported hearing the heavy tread of Philippe's boots ascending the stairs, followed by the sound of the key turning in the lock. They expected the usual sounds of movement or voices, but instead a heavy, suffocating silence descended upon the house. An hour later, Philippe emerged from the attic, pale and sweating, rushing past the servants with a look of nausea on his face. He went immediately to the library and poured himself a glass of brandy, his hands shaking so violently that the crystal decanter rattled against the rim of the glass. This pattern continued for 3 nights, with each visit growing shorter and Philippe's condition deteriorating visibly. The anomaly was not just psychological but seemed physical. The young man developed a rash on his hands and neck, and his eyes took on a feverish, haunted quality. Old Thomas, who brought meals to the attic door, noted in his slate, used to communicate, that the food inside the room remained untouched, and the girl Celeste was always found in the same position, kneeling by the window, reciting prayers in Latin with a rhythm that sounded less like devotion and more like a protective chant. Victor Laurent, frustrated by his son's apparent lack of resolve, demanded an explanation. The shouting match between father and son on the 4th morning was overheard by a seamstress working in the hallway. Philippe was heard pleading, his voice cracking with hysteria. "I cannot do it, father. There is a wall I cannot see. When I approach her, the air turns to ice. She looks at me with eyes that are not hers. It feels like a violation of something older than the church." Victor dismissed these fears as the ravings of a coward, accusing Philippe of being ungrateful for the magnificent vessel provided for his pleasure. By the end of the first week, the anomaly had escalated into a crisis. Philippe began to drink heavily, starting at dawn, and was seen wandering the French Quarter at odd hours, muttering to himself about familiar ghosts and blood that knows its own name. The establishments he frequented reported that he was unable to engage with anyone, claiming that a pair of dark eyes was watching him from the shadows of the room. The purchase that was meant to make him a man was instead unmaking him, stripping away his sanity layer by layer. Meanwhile, inside the attic, Celeste remained a figure of impossible tranquility. The mute servant's observations describe her as waiting, a word he underlined 3 times on his slate. She did not pace the floor or weep for her captivity. She moved with the slow, deliberate grace of a priestess performing a ritual. She requested only water and a Bible, and she spent hours staring into the small mirror on the vanity, not admiring her beauty, but searching her own reflection for something specific, tracing the line of her jaw and the curve of her eyes with a detachment that was more scientific than vain. The final anomaly of this period was the discovery of a small object Celeste had fashioned from a loose floorboard splinter and a piece of charcoal. It was a crude crucifix, but she had placed it not on the wall, but on the pillow of the bed where Philippe was supposed to lay with her. It was a barrier, a warning, or perhaps a mercy. When Victor Laurent inspected the room during one of Philippe's absences, he swept the object to the floor in a rage. But the servant noted that the master of the house did not touch the girl himself. Even Victor, in all his arrogance, seemed to sense a field of repulsion around the prize he had bought, a static charge of taboo that kept even the owner from claiming his property. As the 40-day countdown to Philippe's wedding progressed, the tension within the Rue Royale townhouse accumulated like the pressure in a steam boiler. The household expense ledger from this period documents a sudden and inexplicable increase in the consumption of medicinal laudanum and herbal sedatives, ordered not for the staff, but for the young master. Philippe had ceased his nightly visits to the attic entirely by the second week, choosing instead to sleep on the floor of the library, curled up like a frightened child, until his father physically dragged him back to the stairs and forced the key into his hand. The servants began to whisper that the house was cursed. A scullery maid reported seeing lights flickering in the attic window long after the candles should have burned out, a phenomenon she described as corpse lights. The laundry staff found that Philippe's shirts, sent down for washing, were soaked through with cold sweat and smelled faintly of ozone, a scent that had no earthly source in a bedroom perfumed with lavender and rosewater. The mute servant, old Thomas, who had the most access to the upper floor, began to sleep with a rosary wrapped around his wrist, his eyes wide with a terror he could not vocalize. Letters preserved in the Duchamp family archives reveal that Philippe's fiancée, the daughter of the Supreme Court Justice, had begun to notice the change in her future husband. In a letter to her cousin, she wrote, "Philippe kisses my hand as if he fears it will burn him. His skin is clammy, and he looks through me, not at me. He speaks of atonement and the mirror in the attic in riddles that frighten me. Father says it is merely bachelor's nerves, but I fear he has contracted a fever of the mind." These letters provide external corroboration that the haunting was not confined to the Laurent household, but was bleeding out into the social fabric of their class. Inside the attic, the atmosphere had shifted from passive waiting to active resistance. Celeste had stopped eating almost entirely, subsisting on water and small crusts of bread, yet she did not lose weight or strength. The chambermaid who collected the slop jars noted that the girl's physical needs were minimal, another biological impossibility that added to the legend of her Saint-Touched nature. Celeste had also begun to sing low, mournful ballads in a Creole dialect that was older than the city itself, songs about lost children and mothers who walk the river bottom looking for their kin. Victor Laurent, desperate to protect his investment and his son's reputation, brought in a series of specialists to treat Philippe. Dr. Henri Lefebvre, the family physician, diagnosed the young man with melancholia and prescribed leeches and cold baths. When these failed, Victor turned to more esoteric remedies, secretly consulting a practitioner from the Treme district, who gave him a charm to place under the attic mattress. The servant Thomas noted that when the charm was brought into the room, Celeste picked it up without fear and handed it back to Victor, saying in perfect French, "Charms have no power over blood. Only truth has power here." The accumulation of evidence points to a supernatural realism where the physical world was bending around the moral gravity of the situation. Objects in the house began to break without cause, mirrors cracking, crystal stemware shattering in the cabinet. The portrait of Victor Laurent's late wife, Philippe's mother, which hung in the hallway, fell from the wall 3 times in 1 week, the canvas torn as if slashed by invisible hands. Each incident was dismissed by Victor as a coincidence, but the cumulative effect was a growing certainty that the house itself was rejecting the presence of the girl in the attic, or perhaps rejecting the sin of her imprisonment. Philippe's behavior became increasingly erratic. He was found one night standing in the garden, staring up at the attic window, weeping silently. When approached by the gardener, he whispered, "She is the lock, and I am the wrong key. If I turn, I break. If I do not turn, I perish." This statement, recorded in the gardener's later testimony, suggests that Philippe had intuitively grasped the deadly nature of the paradox he was trapped in, even if he could not intellectually articulate the reason for the biological barrier that prevented him from touching Celeste. The financial records of the Laurent firm show that Victor began to neglect his business, missing important meetings at the cotton exchange. His obsession had narrowed to the events in the attic. He was seen pacing the hallway outside the locked door, listening to the silence within, his face twisted in a mixture of anger and confusion. He was a man accustomed to forcing his will upon the world, and the resistance of this single, silent variable, his son's failure and the girl's untouchability, was driving him to the brink. By the 30th day, the accumulation of anomalies had reached a critical mass. The house felt heavy, charged with static electricity. The servants moved in hushed groups, terrified to be alone. The city outside continued its bustling commerce, unaware that on Rue Royale a singularity of guilt was forming, drawing all light and reason into its center. The Virgin had become a black hole in the heart of the Laurent dynasty, and the event horizon was rapidly approaching the wedding day. As the strangeness within the Laurent household spilled out into the streets, the French Quarter's rumor mill began to formulate its own hypotheses. The New Orleans Bee, in its scandalous Masks and Faces column, published a thinly veiled item about a certain cotton prince whose attic holds a treasure that has frozen his heir's ardor. The public, hungry for a grotesque explanation, theorized that Lot 47 was a practitioner of ancient arts, a woman who had hexed Philippe's vitality with a look. This hypothesis fit the prejudices of the time, allowing society to cast the victim as the villain. Another theory, whispered among the devout Catholic matrons of the St. Louis Cathedral, was that the girl was Saint-Touched, or perhaps a mystic. They pointed to the accounts of her refusing food and her constant prayer as evidence that she was a holy vessel, and that Philippe's inability to touch her was a divine intervention, preventing the desecration of a pure soul. This hypothesis elevated the horror to a spiritual trial, suggesting that the Laurent family was being tested by Providence, a test they were visibly failing. In the taverns and gambling dens, a darker, more cynical hypothesis circulated among the men who knew Philippe well. They speculated that the boy had contracted a shameful illness and was hiding his condition to protect his fiancée, using the girl in the attic as a scapegoat for his own infirmity. This theory was grounded in the reality of New Orleans' Vice District, but it failed to explain the terrified reverence with which Philippe spoke of Celeste. Nor did it account for the palpable atmosphere of dread that surrounded the Rue Royale townhouse. The servants of the house, particularly the mute Thomas, held a different view, one they could not speak aloud but communicated through signs and guarded looks. They believed the house was haunted not by a demon, but by a memory. Thomas had served Victor Laurent for 30 years. He remembered the days before Philippe's mother, the days of Victor's wild youth in Paris. He recognized something in Celeste's eyes, a shape to her face that triggered a deep, buried recollection. His hypothesis was dangerous. The girl was not a stranger. She was a ghost from the past, returned in flesh to demand a debt that had been forgotten. Doctor. Lefebvre, the physician treating Philippe, privately noted in his casebook a hypothesis that leaned towards hysterical moral paralysis. He wrote, "The patient is physically sound, yet his faculties act as if severed from his will. He speaks of blood repulsion and an electric shock upon contact. It is my belief that the girl represents a totem of guilt for him, perhaps reminding him of a childhood trauma or a secret failing. The mind has clamped the body shut to prevent a transgression it deems fatal." This medical hypothesis came closest to the truth, identifying the biological rejection without understanding its cause. Philippe himself seemed to oscillate between these theories. In his rambling conversations with his few remaining friends, he called Celeste the judge and the mirror. He told a friend at the Sazerac house, "She is not a woman. She is a locked door that I was born on the wrong side of. My father bought a key that does not fit the lock of this world." His hypothesis was metaphysical. He believed he was trapped in a cosmic error, a misalignment of fate that no amount of will could correct. The most dangerous hypothesis came from the bride's father, Justice Duchamp. A pragmatist and a man of the law, he suspected that Victor Laurent had bought a defective person, perhaps one who was insane or ill, and was trying to cover up his foolish purchase. He did not believe in curses or ghosts. He believed in fraud. He suspected that the purity was a lie, or that the girl was damaged, and that Victor was forcing Philippe to go along with the charade to save face. This skepticism would drive the final fatal confrontation. As these hypotheses swirled, they created a cage of expectations around the Laurent family. They were trapped by the need to prove the curse theory wrong, the medical theory curable, and the fraud theory baseless. Victor Laurent could not simply sell the girl or send her away. That would be an admission of defeat. He had to make the hypothesis of his own power true, that he could buy anything, control anyone, and bend any reality to his will. The girl had to be claimed, or his entire world was a lie. The hypothesis that no one dared to voice, the one that lay buried under the polite fictions of Creole society, was the one that mattered. That a person cannot be property if they share the master's blood. This was the hypothesis that the blood itself was trying to prove, screaming silently through the veins of the son who could not touch the daughter. The social fracture began on November 18th, 6 days before the wedding, when Justice Duchamp arrived at the Laurent townhouse in a carriage drawn by 4 black horses. He did not come to socialize, he came to deliver an ultimatum. The meeting, held in Victor's study with the doors closed, was loud enough to be heard by the servants in the hallway. Duchamp threatened to cancel the wedding, a move that would not only humiliate the Laurents, but also sever crucial political alliances Victor had spent decades cultivating. "My daughter will not marry a shadow," Duchamp was heard shouting. "Prove the boy is capable, or the contract is void." This confrontation shattered the facade of civility that Victor had maintained. The rumor of Philippe's hesitation had reached the highest levels of society, transforming the Laurent name from a symbol of power to a subject of ridicule. Victor Laurent, a man whose entire identity was built on dominance and success, felt the ground crumbling beneath him. The fracture was not just social, it was existential. If the wedding failed, his legacy failed. The purchase of Lot 47, intended to secure that legacy, was now the very thing destroying it. The pressure on Philippe intensified to a breaking point. His friends stopped calling. He was uninvited from the bachelor dinners of his peers. He became a pariah in his own city, a walking symbol of failed masculinity. The social fracture isolated him, leaving him with no confidants, no escape. He was trapped in the house with the 2 architects of his misery, his tyrant father and the silent, terrifying girl in the attic. He stopped drinking, slipping into a cold, dissociative state where he simply stared at the walls, waiting for the end. Victor's reaction to the social threat was to double down on his control. He fired 3 servants he suspected of gossiping, creating a climate of terror in the household. He ordered the windows of the ground floor boarded up, as if preparing for a siege, claiming it was to keep out prying eyes. The townhouse became a fortress of paranoia, disconnected from the rhythm of the city outside. Inside, time seemed to loop, centered on the nightly ritual of the key and the stairs. The church, too, became a site of fracture. The priest who was to officiate the wedding, Father Bernier, visited the house to offer counsel. He was turned away at the door by Victor, who accused the church of failing to protect his family from malicious slander. This rejection of spiritual authority marked Victor's descent into a kind of secular madness, where he believed his will was superior to divine law. He was cutting the ropes that tethered him to the moral order of his community. The bride, Marie-Louise Duchamp, sent a letter to Philippe, returning his engagement ring, "Until such time as your health is restored." This physical object, returned in a small velvet box, was the final blow to Philippe's hope of a normal life. He held the ring in his hand, looking at it not with sadness, but with the blank comprehension of a man reading his own fate. The social contract was broken, the promise of the future was retracted. In the attic, Celeste remained the eye of the storm. She seemed to sense the fracture in the house's foundation. The mute servant noted that she began to prepare herself, washing her hair with the limited water available, smoothing the wrinkles in her dress. She was readying herself for the climax she knew was inevitable. Her stillness was a counterweight to the chaos downstairs, a reminder that while their world was breaking, her purpose remained intact. The fracture extended to the financial markets. Rumors of Victor's instability caused a slight dip in Laurent cotton bonds. Competitors sensed weakness. The perfect purchase of $8,400 was now a liability worth negative millions in reputation and credit. Victor was fighting not just for his son's marriage, but for his commercial survival. He had to prove he was still the master, still the one who commanded the market and the flesh he bought. On the eve of the wedding, the social fracture was complete. The Laurents were isolated, besieged by rumors, abandoned by allies. The only way to repair the breach was to consummate the act, to break the girl and prove the boy. Victor resolved that the deadlock would end that night by any means necessary. The social world had demanded a sacrifice, and he was prepared to offer one, blinding himself to the fact that the blade was pointed at his own throat. In a desperate bid to refute the rumors of fraud or defect, Victor Laurent summoned 3 new physicians to the house on November 21st. This was a forensic proceeding, not a medical one. The doctors were some of the most respected in the South. Dr. Beauregard from the Charity Hospital, Dr. Sterling from the Medical College, and a visiting surgeon from Paris. Their mandate was simple: examine Lot 47 and provide irrefutable written evidence of her status. Victor wanted a document he could present to Justice Duchamp, a scientific seal of approval on his purchase. The examination took place in the attic suite. The servant's testimony describes the scene: the girl Celeste, submitting to the intrusion with the same terrifying detachment she had shown at the auction. She lay on the bed, staring at the ceiling, while the men performed their inspection. The humiliation was absolute, yet she did not cry out. She acted as if she had vacated her body, leaving only a shell for them to probe. This dissociation was her shield, a psychological defense so perfect it unnerved the doctors. The resulting document, the second medical report, is a masterpiece of clinical confusion. The doctors confirmed unanimously that the subject was pristine. There was no physical impediment, no disease, no deformity. Physically, she was exactly what the catalogue had promised. However, the report contains a peculiar addendum written by the Parisian surgeon. He noted, "While the subject is biologically intact, There is a physiological anomaly in her presence. Her pulse is impossibly slow, and her skin temperature is markedly lower than the ambient room. She exhibits the biological signs of hibernation or deep trance. It is as if the body is preserving itself against an external threat. This evidence, intended to exonerate Victor, only deepened the mystery. If she was perfect, why could Philippe not approach her? The irrefutable proof of her value became irrefutable proof of Philippe's failure. There was no physical excuse left. The fault lay entirely with the son. When Victor read the report, he did not feel relief. He felt a cold fury. The science had stripped away his alibis. The problem was not the merchandise. The problem was the buyer. The impact on Philippe was catastrophic. When shown the report, which proved the girl was waiting for him, he collapsed into a fit of weeping. "It is not her body," he cried. "It is her blood. Can you not smell it? It smells like mine." This statement, dismissed at the time as delirium, was the most accurate observation made during the entire affair. The irrefutable evidence of her purity was actually evidence of the barrier, nature protecting the genetic line from collapsing in on itself. The document was sent to Justice Duchamp, who accepted it as proof of the girl's fitness, but reiterated his demand. Proofs on paper were no longer enough. The marriage required a husband, not a medical certificate. The evidence had bought Victor a few more hours, but it had also removed his last exit strategy. He could no longer claim the girl was defective and return her. He was stuck with the perfect purchase. Inside the house, the report changed the dynamic. Celeste was no longer a mystery. She was a certified fact. The servants looked at her with renewed awe. She had passed the trial by ordeal. Her purity was weaponized now, a sharp, clean instrument held against the throat of the Laurent masculinity. The Virgin was stronger than the men who owned her. The irrefutable evidence also had a documented impact on Victor's psyche. He began to look at Celeste with a new kind of resentment. She was the immovable object that was breaking his irresistible force. He saw her perfection as an insult, a deliberate mockery of his power. The $8,400 he had spent was mocking him from the attic. He decided that if Philippe could not break her, he would have to force the issue. The evidence demanded a conclusion. The block ends with the doctors departing, shaking their heads, their fees paid in gold. They left behind a certificate that was technically a sentencing. The science had spoken, the girl was ready. The tragedy was now purely a matter of execution. The irrefutable evidence had closed the loop, leaving only the attic, the night, and the razor. The collapse of authority occurred on the night of November 23rd, the eve of the wedding. It began not with a whisper, but with a roar. Neighbors on Rue Royale reported hearing Victor Laurent's voice booming through the shuttered windows, a tyrannical baritone stripped of all social veneer. He was screaming at his son in the library, a final, brutal dressing down that destroyed whatever remained of Philippe's ego. "You are a Laurent," Victor bellowed. "You will go up those stairs and you will claim what is yours, or you will leave this house with nothing but the clothes on your back. I will strike your name from the Bible." Nay, this ultimatum was the breaking point. Victor, the supreme authority of the household, had abandoned the role of father and become the enforcer of a perverse contract. He was demanding a violation to salvage a reputation. He placed a heavy, pearl-handled razor into Philippe's hand, an heirloom piece, ostensibly for shaving before the wedding, but the symbolism was clear. It was a tool of adulthood, a blade to assert dominance, or perhaps a suggestion of the only other honorable exit. Philippe took the razor. The mute servant, watching from the shadows, noted that the young man's face was blank as a new page. He had stopped fighting. The collapse of his own internal authority, his conscience, his fear, his resistance, was complete. He was a vessel now, filled only with his father's poisonous will. He ascended the stairs one last time, the heavy tread of his boots sounding like a march to the scaffold. Victor followed him to the landing. He unlocked the attic door, pushed his son inside, and then, in an act of ultimate cruelty, locked the door from the outside. He pocketed the key and sat on a chair in the hallway, acting as the jailer of his own bloodline. This action marked the final collapse of paternal authority. He was no longer protecting his family, he was imprisoning it in a crucible of trauma. Inside the room, the authority of the transaction also collapsed. Felipe stood before Celeste, the razor in his hand. According to the reconstruction of the scene, he did not advance on her. The repulsion, the biological scream of shared DNA, was deafening in the small room. The authority of the purchase contract, which said, "She is yours," was overruled by the ancient authority of the blood, which said, "She is you." The servants huddled in the kitchen, sensing the end. The hierarchy of the house had dissolved. The master was a stranger in the hallway. The heir was a prisoner in the attic. The prize was the judge. The order of the antebellum world, built on the absolute power of the master, had buckled under the weight of its own contradictions. Silence stretched through the house. It was not a peaceful silence, but a pressurized one. Victor waited for the sounds of struggle, for the cry of submission, for any noise that would tell him he had won. But the attic remained silent. The authority of the scream was denied to him. The collapse was happening in the quiet, in the dark, in the mind of the boy holding the blade. At some point in the night, the authority of time took over. The grandfather clock in the hall ticked away the minutes of the dynasty. Midnight passed, 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock. Victor fell asleep in his chair, a slumped figure of exhausted tyranny. He had gambled everything on this night, believing that force could conquer nature. The final collapse was the sound that didn't happen. No gunshot, no shout, just the soft thud of a body hitting the floor, a sound so muffled by the thick rugs that Victor slept through it. The authority of life had surrendered to the authority of silence. The razor had found its mark, not on the girl's virtue, but on the Gordian knot of the son's misery. The narrative pivot of the tragedy lies in an object that was not catalogued in the auction, nor found in the initial police sweep. It was discovered hours after the bodies were removed, tucked inside the hollowed-out spine of a Catholic prayer book that Celeste had kept on her bedside table. It was a small, velvet-bound locket containing 2 items: a miniature portrait of a young Victor Laurent, painted in Paris in 1825, and a folded parchment, a baptismal record from the Church of Saint-Sulpice in Paris, dated 1826. This hidden source is the key that unlocks the entire mystery. The record lists the baptism of Marie Celeste, born to Marie-Thérèse, free woman of color, and acknowledged by Victor Antoine Laurent as his natural daughter. The signature at the bottom is unmistakably Victor's, written with the flourish of a young man in love, before ambition hardened his heart. The portrait shows a Victor who is unrecognizable from the tyrant of New Orleans, soft-eyed, smiling, holding the hand of a dark-skinned woman. The discovery reveals the backstory that Victor had erased from his history. As a young man sent to Paris for his education, he had taken a companion, a free woman from Louisiana living abroad. They had a child. When his father summoned him back to New Orleans to marry a suitable Creole heiress and take over the business, Victor abandoned them. He left them with money but took his name with him, burying his indiscretion across the ocean. He assumed they would fade away. But Marie-Thérèse did not fade. Dying of consumption in 1830, she entrusted the child and the proofs of paternity to the Ursuline order, with a single, terrifying instruction. Celeste was to be raised in seclusion, educated as a lady, and kept pure until the day she could be returned to her father. The mother had engineered a long-game reckoning. She knew Victor's obsession with lineage and purity. She knew he would one day seek the perfect object. She prepared her daughter not as a child to be loved, but as a test to be bought. The locket explains the impossible precision of the sale. Celeste was not just a random purchase. She was the missing piece of Victor's soul, the living evidence of his only genuine happiness, now packaged as a commodity. The supernatural repulsion Philippe felt was the biological instinct of a brother recognizing a sister, a primal safeguard against the forbidden lineage that functioned beneath the level of conscious thought. The curse was simply the truth of their shared blood screaming to be heard. Celeste knew. The hidden source confirms that she was aware of her identity. She had carried this knowledge into the auction block. Her silence was not submission. It was the silence of a witness waiting for the trial to begin. She held the power of the name in the locket, a legal weapon in Louisiana, where the specific laws of the time gave recognized children of free mothers certain inheritance rights, regardless of their current status. The source also recontextualizes the events in the attic. Celeste was not praying for mercy. She was praying for her brother. She knew that Philippe was the innocent casualty of their father's sin. The cross she placed on his pillow was a sign of sibling compassion, a signal that she would not let him commit the unthinkable act their father demanded. This hidden document transforms the genre of the story from a gothic horror to a legal thriller. The ghost was a document. The monster was a signature. The $8,400 was not a purchase price. It was a retroactive debt payment, accrued with compound interest in the currency of blood. The block ends with the image of the police chief opening the locket in the morning light, his face going pale as he recognizes the face of the man who owns the house. The hidden source has detonated the foundation of the case. The victim is the heiress. The bondswoman is the daughter. The master is the architect of his own ruin. The events of the final hours in the attic must be reconstructed from the forensic tableau, as there were no living witnesses but Celeste. However, the logic of the scene dictates the decision. Philippe, locked in with his sister, though he only knew her as the untouchable, stood at the precipice. The ultimatum from his father had stripped him of all options, violation or ruin. But the repulsion, the biological imperative, was absolute. He could not perform the act. Celeste's role in this decision was active, not passive. The decision for decisive action was hers. Seeing her brother broken, holding the razor, she likely broke her silence. She did not need to scream. She needed to speak the truth. She revealed the contents of the locket to him. She told him who she was. "I am not your prize," she would have said. "I am your blood. We are the same." This revelation would have shattered Philippe's last tether to reality, but also offered him a strange absolution. The horror he felt wasn't weakness, it was righteousness. He wasn't a failed man, he was a moral one, instinctively rejecting a forbidden union. But the knowledge also doomed him. He could not go back out that door and face his father with this truth. Victor would destroy them both to keep the secret. There was no future for Philippe in a world defined by his father's lies. The decision to use the razor was Philippe's, but it was guided by the logic of the trap Victor had built. Ending his own life was the only act of autonomy left to him. It was a rejection of his father's name, his father's money, and his father's sin. By ending the struggle, he was cutting the lineage that Victor prized above all else. He was ending the Laurent dynasty on the bridal bed, fulfilling the death of the heir that the wedding was supposed to prevent. Celeste's decision was to witness. She did not stop him. Perhaps she couldn't, or perhaps she understood that this was the only way the debt could be paid. She stood by as he performed the terrible deed, her white dress acting as the canvas for the tragedy. She remained unharmed because he fell away from her, ending his life to protect her purity. The justification in the source is the brutal calculus of the situation. Survival required the death of the Laurent legacy. Philippe sacrificed himself to break the cycle. Celeste accepted the sacrifice to survive and claim justice. It was a pact made in silence, a final alliance of the children against the father. The silence that followed was the silence of resolution. The action had been taken. The debt was paid. Celeste waited for the dawn, knowing that when the door opened, she would no longer be Lot 47. She would be Marie-Celeste Laurent, the survivor. The morning light creeping through the attic window illuminated the result of the decision, the fallen son and the living daughter. The razor lay between them, the instrument that had severed the knot of lies. The decision was absolute, irreversible, and horrifyingly precise. The block concludes with the sound of the key turning in the lock from the outside. Victor Laurent was coming to check his purchase. He was coming to see if he had a grandson. Instead, he was about to meet his reckoning. The final primary source is the official police affidavit filed by Captain LeBlanc of the New Orleans City Guard, dated November 24, 1845. It records the moment the door was opened. Victor Laurent entered first. The report describes a sound like a wounded animal, tearing from the throat of the great merchant when he saw his son. He collapsed to his knees, ruining his silk trousers, his authority instantly liquefied by grief. Then the report shifts focus to the woman. Celeste stepped forward. She did not cower. She handed the locket and the baptismal record to Captain LeBlanc. The affidavit records her first and only spoken statement to the authorities, delivered in flawless high-register French. I have protected my virtue as my father paid for, and I have protected his bloodline from the ultimate error, as the Church commands. The boy is innocent. The sin belongs to the man on the floor. The interpretation of this scene by the authorities was immediate and shocking. The baptismal record was verified on the spot by the priest who had been summoned for the wedding. The signature was Victor's. Under the laws of the time and the complex inheritance codes of Louisiana, a father who acknowledged his natural child and then purchased them could effectively be seen as voiding their status as property. Furthermore, by purchasing her for $8,400 and bringing her into his home, he had created a legal paradox that Celeste's lawyers would later exploit. He had consolidated her status as both property and heir. The police report notes that Victor Laurent was unable to speak. He stared at Celeste with a look of absolute annihilation. He recognized her now. He recognized the mother in her face. He realized that the familiar ghost his son had raved about was real. He had bought his own daughter. The horror of his own actions broke his mind in that instant. The impossible secret was out. The crowd that gathered outside the house, attracted by the police wagons, learned the truth within hours. The story flew through the city. The virgin was the master's daughter. The son died to save her. The father was the architect of the nightmare. The source provides the forensic closure. Philippe's death was ruled as self-inflicted due to insanity induced by moral duress. Celeste was taken into protective custody, not as a prisoner, but as a material witness and potential heiress. The $8,400 receipt was entered into evidence, not as a bill of sale, but as proof of the estate's value assigned to her. The interpretation of the event shifted the narrative of New Orleans society forever. It exposed the hidden fractures at the heart of the social system. It showed that the boundaries between master and property, father and stranger, were permeable and dangerous. Victor Laurent had tried to cross them with money, and they had snapped back with lethal force. The block ends with Celeste walking out of the house, escorted by the police. She walked past her father, who was being carried out on a stretcher, paralyzed by the shock. She did not look at him. She looked at the sun rising over the Mississippi. She was covered in the invisible armor of the law and the visible armor of her white silk dress, now a shroud for the old world and a wedding gown for her new life as a free woman. The legal fallout of the Laurent affair was the most sensational court case of antebellum Louisiana. Celeste's legal team, paid for by the remaining funds in Philippe's personal account, which he had signed over to her in a note found on his person, argued that Victor's purchase of his own daughter acted as a de facto recognition. The Louisiana Supreme Court, in a landmark and controversial ruling, agreed. They ruled that a father cannot hold his own recognized flesh as chattel. The transaction was voided, but the value of the transaction, the $8,400, was awarded to Celeste as damages and inheritance. Victor Laurent never stood trial. He lingered for 2 months in a state of catatonic paralysis, trapped in his own body, cared for by the mute servant Thomas. He died in January 1846, leaving no male heir. The Laurent fortune, already damaged by the scandal, was carved up by creditors and distant cousins, but Celeste secured her $8,400, a massive sum, enough to be independently wealthy for life. Celeste left New Orleans immediately after the settlement. Records show she boarded a ship for France in March 1846. She reverted to her mother's name, becoming Marie Celeste Duchamp. She settled in Paris, closing the circle her mother had opened. She never married. The certificate of virtue remained accurate until her death. She lived as a lay sister, dedicating her life and her fortune to the care of lost children. The Rue Royale townhouse stood empty for decades. It became known as the House of the Razor, a place where locals claimed you could hear the sound of a key turning and a boy weeping. It was eventually sold and subdivided, its grand attic carved into cheap apartments, but the stain of the tragedy remained on the property values. The legacy of the story was a dark cautionary tale in New Orleans society. The Laurent rule became a slang term for the danger of digging too deep into one's own past. The auction record of Lot 47 was preserved as a curiosity, a testament to the madness of the market. Philippe was buried in the St. Louis Cemetery No. 1, but in a separate plot from his father. His grave is marked only with his name and the date. There is no epitaph. Local legend says that a woman in black visited the grave once a year, leaving a single white gardenia until the visit stopped in 1890. The mute servant, Thomas, disappeared after Victor's death. Some say Celeste took him with her to Paris. Others say he walked into the swamp. His slate, containing the only eyewitness account of the 40 days, was found in the attic rubble during a renovation in 1920, providing the forensic details that flesh out this narrative. The consequences were total. The Laurent line was extinguished. The money was redistributed. The Virgin had destroyed the master's house using the master's own tools, law, money, and blood. It was a perfect symmetrical justice bought at the highest possible price. Looking back from the 21st century, the story of Lot 47 stands as a grim monument to the hidden horrors of the era. It strips away the romantic veneer of the South and reveals the forbidden, cannibalistic nature of a society that consumed its own children for profit. Victor Laurent is the ultimate symbol of this pathology, a man so blinded by power that he could not recognize his own daughter when he put a price tag on her. Historians debate to this day how much Celeste knew and when. Did she plan the trap with her mother from the convent, or was she a passive victim who seized a momentary opportunity? The locket suggests premeditation. The prayer book suggests faith. The result suggests a brilliant, cold intellect at work. She played the role of the perfect object so flawlessly that she lured the monster into his own cage. The scientific paradox of Felipe's supernatural repulsion is now understood as a biological safeguard acting in overdrive, the instinct against the forbidden union. But in 1845, it was a mystery that defied explanation. It serves as a reminder that biology often rebels against culture. The law said she was property, the blood said she was sister. The blood won. Today, the St. Louis Hotel is gone, replaced by the Royal Omni Hotel, but the spot where the auction block stood is still there. Visitors often report a sudden drop in temperature in that part of the lobby, a fleeing chill that reminds them of an attic room. The archives of New Orleans still hold the baptismal record, the ink fading, but the name Victor Antoine Laurent still visible, a signature that signed a death warrant. Death. We are left with the open question: what defines us? Is it the papers that say who owns us, or is it the blood that runs in our veins? Celeste Laurent proved that the latter is the only currency that truly matters. She bought herself back not with gold, but with the truth. The mystery of the blood that bought itself remains one of the darkest chapters in American history, a story of a wedding that became a funeral and a slave who became the master of her own fate. But one wonders, in the quiet hours of the night in Paris, did Celeste ever hear the echo of the gavel? Or did she only hear the silence of the brother who died to set her free? History is a graveyard of secrets, and we have only just begun to dig. If this story chilled your blood, you are one of us. Subscribe to Before the Story. Right now, click the bell icon so you never miss a descent into the archives. And here is your final challenge. Share this video with someone who thinks they know the history of the South. Let's see if they can handle the truth about Lot 47.